This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
All right, guys, today we are going to wrap up our, I would say, unconventional series on Mobster Crazy Joe Gallo with the rather unconventional episode altogether. As just a little bit of background, I have been following the Ukraine-Russian conflict since the Orange Revolution all the way back in 2004. Through the Color Revolution and the annexation of Crimea in 2014. I've been all in on following the current conflict, which started with the Russian special military operation going back to February of 2022. Now, hang with us for a minute here. I'm slowly getting to the point. In late August of 2023, the 24th to be exact, the airplane of the controversial Russian oligarch and leader of the private military contract Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, crashed outside of Moscow. While this was happening, this whole thing was happening, Mustache Chris and I were finishing up the series, very series here on Crazy Joe Gallo, and it hit me how close their stories are in so many different ways. I thought it might be interesting and fun to compare these seemingly two very different people and stories, Yevgeny Prigozhin and Crazy Joe Gallo. Just like Joe Gallo, there are so many people who wanted Prigozhin dead and so many motives for killing him. We're going to explore some of the really weird parallels between these two characters. We know the Russo-Ukrainian war is a very hot button issue for many people, and we will do our very best to keep this episode from going nuclear. Chris, what do you think about, I guess, as a way to wrap up Crazy Joe Gallo, that comparing these two, you might dare say crazy people?
I'll be completely honest with you. At first, I had no idea where you were going with this. But then I started reading into, I used to be kind of like a news junkie, and I used to follow the news daily. In the last couple of years, I really haven't been doing that all that much. I mean, I've been following the Ukraine-Russia conflict big picture wise. And like you pointed out, I've been following it, like not maybe as closely as you, but kind of since it's been brewing, which is, I mean, many, many years. It's not like we just, this just happened over the weekend type thing. And I was I was aware of the Wagner Group, and I was aware of Prigozhin, but I didn't know much about him. And then I started reading about him, and then it, especially later on in his life, and I started realizing it's like, okay, yeah, now I can see the point in trying to contrast these two, especially with and it just makes sense because it's, Joe's been dead for a while now, and Prigozhin just died not too long ago. And I like comparing different times in history to one another. I think it's a good skill to have. I believe a lot of like historians and I guess people in like the history podcast community don't like doing it, but I think it's a really important skill to have when you can contrast different time periods in history, or contrast things that seemingly don't have much connections to one another, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I figured that this one would be right up your alley once you got into it. We'll do a little bit of background on Prigozhin just to set the table a little bit if people aren't aware so much of his background, and hopefully you are more up to date on Crazy Joe Gallo's background. But if you're just jumping into this series right at the end, I definitely recommend you go and listen to all of our previous episodes on Joe Gallo, because I think he is just one of the most fascinating characters to come out of the American Mafia. But we'll weave in a little bit of his background and context, but there's a lot to this guy. But today we'll just focus in on Yevgeny Prigozhin's background. Chris, maybe you can tell us a little bit about his early life.
Yeah. So we're just gonna kind of give people a little light overview. Prigozhin, he was born on June 1st, 1961 in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. A fairly normal upbringing from my understanding at that time, living in the Soviet Union. His mother was a nurse. His dad was a mining engineer. He died when he was quite young, actually. And like his grandfather was like a scientist, and he came from a pretty, I guess, pretty high IQ family, right? And they did fairly well for themselves in the Soviet Union, as well as you could do in a situation like that. But Prigozhin would end up getting involved in crime as a teenager. He would be caught stealing one time. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison, where he worked in a chemical plant in Novgorod. And if people are not familiar with the Russian geography, Novgorod is really cold. It's probably not the nicest places, one of the nicest places to be working at a chemical plant. But like he didn't learn any lessons from that. And as soon as he got out, he started committing crimes again. And he was caught stealing jewelry from a lady and choking her out, actually. And then this is when the sentence got really serious, and he ended up got sentenced to 12 years at a penal colony. I believe he only ended up serving 10 years, but while he was at this penal colony, he learned a few practical skills, how to be a machine operator, drive a tractor, and started reading a lot of books extensively, which is interesting because that's a direct parallel to Joe Gallo. From my research, is Joe wasn't much of a reader until he went to prison. And when he went to prison, he became a big time reader. And yeah, basically like Prigozhin became tough as nails, working, living and being in this Russian Soviet penal colony for 10 years. And then when he got out of prison, believe it or not, he was actually selling hot dogs with his mom and dad, I guess, at this open air market that was still at this time Leningrad. And then this is where, because we're talking about modern history, it's hard to kind of get to the details. But from what I was reading, he made a fair amount of money selling hot dogs. I'm pretty sure he wasn't just selling hot dogs, but started opening up some of his own businesses, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because there was a big rush. All of a sudden it was an open market. Entrepreneurship was encouraged. Yeah, he got involved in the grocery business, and then he would kind of get involved in gambling and casinos and strip joints and all different types of things that you typically associate with organized crime. That's when I was researching the guy. I'm like, yeah, this dude's a gangster. That ended up going legit. I don't know. How do you feel about it?
I mean, looking at him against Joe Gallo and comparing and contrasting, it's hard to say that there's not a ton of similarities between the two. Doing 10 years in jail and really using that time to become well-read and to learn skills. But then basically, as soon as you get out, you're really back into the life. And like you said, we don't know exactly what Prigozhin, and it'll probably take decades to really sift through what the guy was really up to. But, when you're coming out into the early 90s in Russia, post fall of the Soviet Union, the whole idea of government and crime and organized crime kind of blend together. It's really hard to separate those two things. I mean, as soon as as soon as the Soviets didn't really have anything under control, that whole government under Yeltsin, and I mean, it was just a kleptocracy right out of the gates.
Yeah, so later on, I guess this is probably the part that people might know a little bit more about Prigozhin, but in like 95, him and some of his friends decided that they were going to get into the restaurant business, because it's been kind of all over the news over the last couple of days. They actually refurbished, it was like a boat, and became like one of the most fancy restaurants in the world. I think they spent, from what I read, they spent about $500,000 on rebuilding this boat. And yeah, he opened up the couple of different restaurants and made a ton of money. And he would end up actually serving on this boat, George W. Bush, who now claims that he was shocked that Prigozhin was serving him dinner, which is, I mean, I don't know what your opinion on George W. Bush is, but stuff like that just kind of drives me crazy. And I'm like, what, you didn't know that this, I don't know. Sorry, I'm just going on a tangent there. He would serve like the French president and obviously Vladimir Putin many times. And eventually his success in the restaurant business led to him getting catering contracts for the army that were upwards to, from what I read, $1.2 billion a year. Just more kind of like mob parallels, he gets into the restaurant business and fancy restaurant business, local celebrities are coming to his restaurants, and, eventually starts getting into these lucrative government contracts.
The parallels with the restaurant business, I mean, you're absolutely right that the mafia was always involved with restaurants. I mean, even to this day in Italy, the mafia makes more money off of restaurants and agriculture crime than they ever would make in drugs. There's a lot of instances of agriculture crime in the United States, and it's so easy. There's hardly any enforcement, because who cares if a truckload of cashews, even if the truckload of cashews is worth like $1.5–2 million, nobody cares. So you have and they're usually in rural areas, and it just doesn't raise to the value of, or to the popular imagination of drugs and alcohol and that sort of thing. And that's why they get away with it so much.
Yeah, there's even another. I'm trying to think, the guy in Buffalo. What's his name? The Nova Pizza guy. Now it's up for debate whether he's mob or not. But I mean, he's got exclusive contracts for, I believe it's the Sabres and the Bills,
and a lot of other things too. Things like that. It just, we're not accusing Joe Todaro of anything untoward or anything. But when you start seeing people get all these contracts like Prigozhin, it starts to make you ask some questions. The one that of their early life that I just keep going back to is that this idea of both of them really taking jail and refocusing themselves to almost make a new version of themselves when they come out of jail. I mean, obviously, Prigozhin skyrocketed in a way that Joe Gallo never did and probably couldn't, given the time. I mean, who knows? Maybe if Joe Gallo came up in the 80s in Russia, or if the United States had collapsed into a kleptocracy in 1970, he would have become a billionaire government contractor. But you can see how they both came out as very different men. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like Joe, I think Joe, like Joe Gallo, when he was in prison, I think that's when he started consciously thinking about creating like a myth about himself. He comes out and he starts hanging out with like kind of local celebrities, and even by that point, even when he went to prison, he was kind of like a larger than life figure, him and his crew. And Prigozhin, you could tell he learned some real practical skills when he was in prison and applied it to when he got out. And then he had add on top of it, like the Soviet Union's collapse, the government's not really being all that effective. For a guy who's just like driven like Prigozhin and ruthless in many ways, it's very, I wouldn't say it was easy, but it's easier to kind of get into like the legitimate side of business, which is what he ended up doing, getting these, government contracts, providing food to the government. Like Joe never became legit, but Prigozhin did. But you pointed it out that I think a lot of these gangster types that they'd say had grown up in during the collapse of the Soviet Union probably could have became legit. Like, I don't see why somebody like John Gotti wouldn't have been able to do it. They fill a vacuum. There's not, the bureaucracy that was in place is gone, and they're not rehiring. I mean, in some cases they did end up rehiring a lot of these ex-Soviets. Putin himself was ex-KGB, right? But a lot of the times it's they need new people to fill in this void. And John Gotti had certain skills, right? He was a businessman. He was ruthless. Joe Gallo, same thing, right? I just don't think Joe Gallo really would have had the temperament to stay legit. And with Prigozhin, as we kind of get later into his life, I don't think he had the temperament to really be legit himself either.
Yeah, I think that maybe not John Gotti, because he was not one in legitimate businesses as much, but like somebody like Chin Gigante or
Paul
Sammy the
Castellano.
Bull Gravano, who were really in up to their elbows in legitimate businesses. It's not a huge leap. In New York City, those guys were making multiple millions of dollars on different contracts and government contracts. It's very similar, just on a slightly smaller scale. But let's talk, let's bring us up to speed to the Wagner Group.
Yeah, so I guess if people aren't familiar with what the Wagner Group is, to kind of quickly sum it up, is like the Wagner Group's it's called a PMC. It's a private military company, and it's a kind of a tricky relationship with its relationship to the Russian government. Like technically, the Wagner Group's its own thing, right? It's gets hired by the Russian government, not really, but kind of does, to pursue Russian interests around the world, but it gives the Russian government somewhat plausible deniability. Like the Russian government will provide with the conflict in the Ukraine, they've been providing the ammunition and the resources to actually fight conflict. I'm not as familiar with because the Wagner Group is also in Syria. They were also in parts of Africa. So it's somewhat of a tricky relationship. I guess a comparison I can make that maybe Americans and Canadians would understand is maybe Blackwater. That's a private military company, but it's kind of doing the business of the government. It's this gray area. You mentioned something, the French Foreign Legion, but wasn't the French Foreign Legion officially part of the French military?
Well, that's where I think that the Wagner Group kind of blends. It was never really truly private. They get all of their funding. They're completely funded by the Russian government. It's not exactly contracted like, say, Blackwater is. The Wagner Group was completely, all their logistics were through the Russian government, and they were really set up to be entirely a foreign service, because I believe that the Wagner Group was not allowed to operate on Russian soil by the Russian Constitution, and the Russian military was never really equipped to operate overseas, and so this PMC was kind of built to fill this gap of operating overseas in low intensity combat, and they really made their first debut, you might say, in 2014 during the Russian annexation of Crimea. And it's really, that's kind of, again, we're kind of, since we're really not into history yet, it's very much in current events. All of this stuff is very, very gray. And even everything that we say, we don't know exactly. Prigozhin, if you were following along and noticed, he had no military background whatsoever. It was really another kind of grift for him to have. The people who were really running the operation, whereas I think they call them the four colonels. The one that we'll mention today was this guy named Dmitry Utkin, if you see a picture of this guy, he's basically like, he'll live in your nightmares. And probably some of the stuff that he did would live in your nightmares too, if you heard it. I mean, he was a hardcore Russian special forces guy. And he was really these colonels were the ones who were running the day-to-day operations. Prigozhin never had a word to say in any actual military decisions. That was not his position. He was really a figurehead and sort of the PR guy, because we see that if you follow the news at all, that's what he did, is that he was very good at PR. Oh, one little factoid that I didn't even know until very recently is the Wagner Group actually fought the U.S. military in Syria. That is a very dirty war that it's going on in Syria right now. And I highly suggest people go take a look at it, because it's absolutely insane what's going on. But they actually did fight, and the U.S. military, it was a group of U.S. special forces who were protecting a oil rig in Western Syria. And well, we won't get into all the problems and the issues with that, but they completely destroyed the Wagner Group because, interestingly enough, the U.S. called in all sorts of air power, just like one thing after another. And the Russian government from Moscow wouldn't allow the Wagner Group to use all the SA-4 anti-aircraft missiles that they had. So they were basically completely left out to dry, which, remember, that was something that Prigozhin had in his back of his mind. I don't know, but I think in the end it was probably a good thing, because if the Wagner Group did fire up those anti-aircraft missiles and shoot down a whole bunch of U.S. aircraft, we probably would have had World War III back in February 7th of 2018. But moving all of that aside, we're kind of getting off of the point of Crazy Joe. Just to get it back to Crazy Joe, there's the Wagner revolt, maybe mutiny, maybe rebellion, that happened from June 23rd, a Friday, to early June 24th of 2023. It was basically a less than 24-hour revolt. Nobody's exactly sure what the purpose was. And that so much reminded me of Crazy Joe's rebellion, I guess you might say, against the Dons of the Colombo family. And maybe you can just quickly get people up to speed on that.
Joe Gallo was part of the Profaci family. Most people probably know it by the Colombo family, but Joe Profaci, who was the head of the Profaci family, he was notorious for being very greedy and stingy with his fellow family members. And Joe Gallo and his brothers and his crew decided that they had finally had enough of Joe Profaci's penny pinching and pettiness. So they decided that they were just going to kidnap Joe Profaci and his inner circle. They didn't end up kidnapping Joe Profaci, but they kidnapped a fair amount of his inner circle and demanded a ransom. One thing led to another. Joe Profaci decides that he's going to pay for it, so he pays for it, but ends up trying to kill Joe Gallo and his crew, and this leads to a civil war going on in the Colombo family that we know is like the first Colombo War. And then Joe Gallo ends up going to jail before the first Colombo War is actually over.
And so with the with the Wagner rebellion, they had been taken off the line. They were fighting a really big battle in the city of Bakhmut. And after that battle was done, the Wagner forces were taken off the line to rest and recuperate. But in the couple of weeks before that, Prigozhin had been acting kind of strangely and making some really strange videos that he was highly critical of all the top brass in Russia, everybody short of Putin. He never said a bad word about Putin, but he said some just like really off the wall stuff about the top generals. And that led to that August or that June 23rd to 24th revolt, where the Wagner Group, or at least a portion of it, about 5,000 of the soldiers of the Wagner Group, tried to storm a major Russian city, and they took to the road and went on a march from this city of Rostov up to Moscow, which we'll get into a couple of the details of that I've had some problems getting my head around. They attacked Russian forces and even killed 12 Russian aircrew members by shooting down a whole bunch. I think it was several attack helicopters that weren't even attacking them. They were just following their convoy. Now, this wasn't the entire Wagner Group, which kind of makes it interesting to think about that not everybody joined in on this revolt. But I think it's the same thing that Prigozhin's March on Moscow, he never said that he was taking out Putin, which what do you think you would do with a revolt? His whole idea of the revolt is to take out the Minister of Defense and some top-ranking generals. I think that's a major comparison to me, and that's the one that I really thought of that struck me with Joe Gallo is neither of these plans seem to have, even if they worked perfectly, they had no end goal in mind. That if they completely worked out, if Joe actually did take out those lower level, that upper level, the upper echelon leadership of the Profaci family, short of Joe Profaci, because he couldn't touch Joe Profaci. And the same thing with Prigozhin. If he took out these generals, but can't take out Putin, what do you win there? There's like no victory strategy. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Well, I think with Joe Gallo, what he was thinking, Joe Gallo was just crazy too, right? Like legitimately crazy, mentally ill. I guess he thought like if, I take out Joe Profaci, I'll just end up becoming, the boss of the Colombo family. But like, as you pointed out, it wasn't necessary. Not everyone supported Joe Gallo within the Colombo family. And as you pointed out, not everybody in the Wagner Group supported what Prigozhin and the, what you said, 5,000 soldiers?
Yeah, something like that.
Were doing themselves. So they were kind of like a splinter group within a splinter group, if that comparison works. With Prigozhin it's interesting. I kind of somewhat get his perspective where there's a long history in Russia of, if you read a little bit about the Romanov dynasty, it's never the czar's fault. It's always the ministers around the czar. It's their fault, right? If the ministers are keeping like the right information from getting to the czar, and that's why the czar is not able to act upon it. And I'm not saying that comparison directly, like, I don't think people in Russia see Putin as a czar. They obviously don't. But that kind of that tradition of maybe Prigozhin thought, I don't think Putin really gets how badly these defense ministers are actually running this conflict. And I don't have a problem with Putin per se. Like my job is to get Putin to realize just how badly this war effort is being ran by these people. Because it's weird though, because like Prigozhin was always said that he was 100% in support of the war that's going on with the Ukraine, and that he said some odd things where he was just like, oh, it was all a lie. But then he turned around and said, like, oh, no. Like, I'm still 100% in support of the war. I don't know. It's weird. It's kind of like Joe Gallo, where you would think, well, Joe Profaci's out of the picture, like conflict's kind of over, right? And he gets out of prison and he's talking to Joe Colombo, and Joe Colombo's like, so we're good, right? And Joe, Crazy Joe's like, no, the war's not over. Like, I never signed that peace agreement. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, you had a problem with Joe Profaci, not me. Let's start on fresh foot here, right? Or, like you pointed out, I don't know, like, it's convoluted, both of their goals, really, at the end of the day, especially Prigozhin, saying he's 100% in support of the war during this entire time, and then turns around and says something that's all built on lies. I don't know, it's kind of bizarre. I don't know exactly what he was trying to go for.
One of the things that I kept thinking about is that people like Joe Gallo and Prigozhin, they think just because they're right, they believe in themselves so much in their ability to get things done, that if they just do something, it's going to work. And it doesn't really matter that other people have there's different priorities, that their small priority doesn't translate to the needs of the much bigger, in the case of the Profaci family, the much larger family, or in the case of this, that Prigozhin's one slice of the war, that there's a war going on that's much bigger than him. And I think that both of them couldn't see that there was a much bigger picture beyond just themselves and their own priorities.
Well, that's exactly it. Like, I think I understand where Crazy Joe's coming from in terms of, I don't like Joe Profaci. I've read a lot about Joe Profaci, and everything that I've read about him is I dislike this man very much. He's greedy, he's petty, he's delusional about exactly what he is. He walks around calling himself like a devout Roman Catholic, and yeah, he was in a lot of ways. He prayed every day. He had a personal altar. He donated, I get, a lot to the church, but he was also a massive drug dealer and was into prostitution and every vice that you can possibly think of. Like, how do you sit there and call yourself a devout Roman Catholic? Just doesn't make sense. Like, for me, I'd be same as Joe, being like, you're just full of crap, right? Like, you're not, like, I can't deal with somebody like you. And like, in terms of the greed too, but I don't think Joe Gallo saw the bigger picture, though, is you can't just go around like trying to kidnap the boss of the bosses of the families. Otherwise, like, the whole system starts collapsing, because if you do it, then everyone else starts doing it. And then, and big picture wise, like, everything that you've built, our thing, La Cosa Nostra, whatever you want to call it, collapses, because you're taking out like a pillar of the institution and how it functions. Is you don't kidnap the boss. And you see that later in the mob history, when everyone starts kind of ratting on each other, even the bosses start ratting, the whole thing starts collapsing. And in terms of Prigozhin, you start, in his defense, I don't think he was lying. He's like, we need ammunition. We're not getting the supplies that we need. And, my soldiers are dying and I'm watching it every single day. Like, why is this not happening? And from his perspective, he looks at it and he goes like, this war effort is not being ran properly. And the defense minister's kids are posting, I think he literally mentioned this, like, the people within the defense ministry, their kids are like posting stuff on Instagram about like new clothes that they're buying. And you're seeing this, and you just had to put somebody in a coffin that, maybe has like, wife and kids. And you're like, and the reason this person's in the coffin is because we're not getting the supplies that we need. Of course you're going to be angry. Of course you're going to be pissed off, right? But you're almost too close to the action. You're not seeing like the big picture of, there's probably good reasons why place is not getting the ammunition that it needs right now, because it's more needed over here, or vice versa, right? You're not seeing the grand picture of it, which is, I mean, for the average soldier, they're not really supposed to see that. But I get why they get angry, like where are the shells? Where's the ammunition? Where's the food? Where's the medical supplies? I'm not getting any of this. And of course, Prigozhin being the type of person that he is, he's going to try to take matters into his own hands. And Joe's the same kind of way.
Yeah, I think that whole idea for both of them of missing the big picture and then having a way overinflated view of their position in the bigger scheme of things really makes them miss the bigger picture. And so when they both do these really big things, it winds up screwing them in the end because they've made so many enemies. You don't think that every one of those capos that Crazy Joe kidnapped, that they don't have crews that are loyal and responsible to their own bosses, that he hasn't made enemies right there because he's made fools of them. And I think it's just this whole idea that they both had, that they were the absolute centers of the universe, and that when everything didn't work exactly the way they expected the universe to work, then they had to lash out.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, you can obviously from both of them, they both have hot tempers, right? They're impulsive. They're not they're not calculating in terms of the way that they're thinking, especially Joe Gallo. It seems like he was just kind of always living moment by moment. And then with Prigozhin, just kind of how his whole rebellion kind of went down. It seems like it was just like an impulsive thing. It's like, oh, it feels like the right time to do it. Let's just go do it.
I think that one thing with Prigozhin, and I wonder how somebody like Crazy Joe would have reacted with this, is that the Wagner Group, most of it was going to be, most of the soldiers in the private military company were going to be transitioned into regular Russian army units, which was basically taking away all of Prigozhin's power and his lucrative contracts. There was a lot of stuff coming down, that contracts that he had fulfilled where he was not fulfilling them properly. He was sending, this is from his food service business, that these contracts that he was doing with the Russian military, he was sending, as much as he was complaining about not getting enough ammunition and enough supplies, he was actually supplying basically rotten food to the Russian military in undersized portions and a lot of stuff like that. So it's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black in that situation. But I think that Prigozhin saw that the writing on the wall was that he was not going to be the center of attention anymore after this, that the Wagner Group was going to get transitioned back to what it was actually established for fighting these low intensity conflicts in places like Africa and in the Middle East and in parts of Asia and wherever else there's things like those types of wars have to get played out. They weren't going to be fighting the grand battles in Ukraine anymore. I think that might have felt like he had to push his hand.
Probably it, right? Like he was worried that he was going to be losing power too. I also think that maybe he just kind of, stir crazy is not the right word, but I think maybe he started actually just suffering from PTSD. If you look into, he was there on the front lines for was like 10 months.
Something. Yeah. During the worst of the fighting, fighting that people even during World War I would have found shocking.
Which, that changes somebody, and that can make somebody's brain crack and not think very rationally. There's a comparison to Joe Gallo. I'm speculating at this point because I don't know for sure whether he was actually suffering from this or not, but I don't think it's far-fetched. Joe Gallo was legitimately suffered from schizophrenia. So he was legitimately crazy. And I think Prigozhin, he started to crack. I don't even want to say under the pressure, just seeing many men that he knew and respected and was fighting side by side. We're talking about a guy that, from everything I read, had no previous military experience.
No, nothing.
He's directly on the front lines in probably the biggest conflict of the modern world. I mean, at least the post Cold War world. And he seems to have done a pretty good job until he started losing it, which is understandable. Like, you're seeing guys get shot every day. You're seeing people get killed, guys that you knew within your own group. But at the same time, you're also seeing the enemy, the Ukrainians get killed. But you start realizing, like, they're also human beings too. And I don't care how cold you are, unless you're like a stone cold sociopath or a serial killer. That's going to affect you too. Just being surrounded by death constantly.
I think one of the other things that I saw a big connection is that there's so many people who had a reason to see Prigozhin killed. He, obviously, the high-ranking people in the Russian military and Russian military establishment certainly had all the reason in the world to want to see him dead. Putin, for being double-crossed, would want to see him dead. Just taking it at face value, obviously the Ukrainians would like to see somebody like that dead. The CIA, all the apparatus inside of NATO could easily want to see this guy dead. And then an added layer potentially. Now, this again, maybe the historians will figure this out decades from now, but there was also word that there could have been a double cross where Prigozhin was working with the Ukrainians at the same time as during that end phase of the Battle of Bakhmut, that he was working with the Ukrainian special intelligence forces. And so if he wound up double crossing them, they'd have extra reason to kill him. And the Russians would have extra reason to kill him for having considered doing a double cross with the Ukrainians in the first place.
I mean, there's a lot of parallels there with the mob, right? How many times have we talked about people double crossing each other? Like one moment you're a friend, and then it's the next moment they're working with the feds, and then maybe they're not working with the feds, and then they become a mobster again. I mean,
the Colombos had every reason to want to kill him. The institutional families, the other families, had a lot of incentive to kill him. Families from outside of New York had incentive to kill him. People in his own crew had incentive to kill him, even if it was just to get him out of the way so that they could raise up in the ranks. I mean, so many parallels there of these people who were the focal points for so much conflict. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, on the last, I think Joe Gallo Part 2 IRL episode, we discussed who we thought, or the potential people that wanted Joe killed. I was a little sympathetic that maybe it was just a crazy, Jerome was just nuts and killed Joe thinking that he was going to look good in the eyes of these mafia guys that he looked up to. I didn't think that was that crazy of an idea. I know a lot of times people kind of dismiss that out of hand. The typical theory that most people think is the commission hired Jerome to kill Joe Colombo to make it look like Joe Gallo did it. And sorry, I was getting the two mixed up there, but it's all interconnected. To make it look like and Joe Gallo did it. And then who actually killed Joe Gallo, I don't know for sure. I mean, there's so many different theories out there. I mean, and the commission had a lot of good reasons to want him killed. He tried to kidnap a mafia boss and maybe pretend, he was like all over the news. He was doing everything that you're not supposed to do as as a mobster. So, I mean, it makes sense the commission had something to do with it. It could have been multiple bosses were involved, and Frank Sheeran, I don't know, he claims he did it. I don't know if I really believe that one or not. With Prigozhin, though, I don't know, it's interesting. I mean, that twist where he starts talking about how the whole war was built on lies and like it's not a justified war. It makes me think that he was working both sides just because it's just so out of place. I don't know, maybe the CIA or, NATO intelligence promised him something and he decided like, oh, well, I got their backing. So he decides to do this rebellion and it fails miserably. I mean, very well, maybe they killed him because it made them look bad. It was embarrassing. I remember when the rebellion all happened and it was all over the news and everyone was saying, well, this is what's going to do Putin in. Like this rebellion's going to happen and Putin's going to get overthrown and we're going to get, like a new Russian government. Or you remember this when it was going on?
Oh,
I'm like,
yeah.
this is crazy. And I'm like, dude, just shows you kind of how little people actually follow. Like even for me, I don't really follow the details. And I'm like, I don't understand what these people are thinking. Like, okay, so the Wagner Group is going to get into power and it's going to make everything better. Like, do you not know what the Wagner Group is or who was in charge of the Wagner Group at one point? Like, I don't know who actually killed Prigozhin though. I mean, the defense minister seemed to have pretty good reasons to want it done. I mean, Putin seems to have pretty good reasons for wanting to do it too, kind of embarrass Putin,
Well, I get even before we get into the who done it, I think that, like you said, I think it was for a lot of people in the West, it was their dream come true, this attack to take down Putin and all that. But if you just looked at the logistics of it, Rostov-on-Don to Moscow is about, I want to say, over 1,000 kilometers, well over 1,000 kilometers. I had just looked at it on a map and it was approximately from Austin, Texas to Nashville or Miami to Washington, D.C. Driving on interstates will take you about 12, 14, 15 hours. And that's going 80 miles an hour in your car. And you're still stopping for gas. That's not stopping to refuel all these military vehicles. You have no air cover. You have no forward scouts. Like you have nothing. And those military vehicles don't go 80, 85 miles an hour. So I just thought that me being like Mr. I know nothing. I'm not a military man. I'm not a CIA, but I read a book about war and I can see that that's just absurd. I've driven in my life and I just thought that was absurd. So that's what kind of started to make me think that the double cross might have been in the play, where to make it Prigozhin to maybe get more information out of NATO or to get something, Putin almost made him do this, but then that doesn't explain why they shot down aircraft. So I did that. I don't know. And I personally, anybody who says that they can explain what happened there, I'm sorry, they don't know what they're talking about. I'm just going to say it flat out on this program, that anybody who says they understand that and this was because of this, don't listen to that person because they don't know.
Yeah, a lot of this conflict, it's in particular when this rebellion happened, I just basically go on Daryl Cooper's Martyr Maid Twitter feed just to see what he says, because I've been talking to him for years and years and years, and I know he's an honest guy, right? And even him at the time, he was like, I don't know what to make of this. It doesn't make much sense. So I'm like, well, he's honest. He's not going to sit there and pretend like he knows exactly what's going on. And that's generally the opinion that I have. Like, I don't really understand. I didn't understand at the time what he was trying to accomplish. And I still don't really understand it fully. I mean, it could be just as simple as he was becoming pretty popular amongst a segment of the Russian population for being kind of like a populist critic of the war effort and the government itself. I mean, these people always get a certain level of popularity. Maybe it was just as simple as it went to his head, thinking that he had this mass following and that, doing a march, as long as you pointed out that he was going to gather followers as he was doing this march and, releasing his populist criticisms of at least the Russian war effort. By the time that he got Moscow, he would have like more than enough people to overthrow the government, or at least overthrow the war ministry. And obviously did not think it, obviously predicted wrong, because that's not what happened at all. It could be as simple as that. Or maybe it just doesn't have to be. Maybe there's no double cross and there's no NATO doing this and all this other stuff. It could be he just overplayed his hand.
That's definitely possible. For sure. And I think that you can't discount that. Now, to the death of Prigozhin, that happened on August 23rd of 2023. What I thought with that is, initially, I think I was probably like almost everybody else, that, Putin just iced this guy and the end. But when you start to look at it more deeply, I'm fairly well convinced that Putin had nothing to do with it. And I think that's based on a couple of factors. One, he could have killed him at any time. Why let Prigozhin? He was going around. He was hanging out in St. Petersburg. He was hanging out in Moscow, even though he wasn't allowed. He wasn't supposed to. He was supposed to be in Belarus, but he was still living his best life inside of Russia. And Putin didn't do anything. Generally, people say that Putin's such an ice cold killer, but there's actually not a lot of evidence, direct or like really solid evidence of people who he actually has killed. There's been a lot of claims that he has, but there's really not a lot, if you think of it compared to a lot of other world leaders. Also, if he had just killed him, obviously Prigozhin dies and everybody's blaming Putin. So that was a reason for Putin to want to keep Prigozhin alive, to not have him look like the cold-blooded Vlad the Impaler. And he couldn't put Prigozhin on trial because it would just look like a show trial. Now, there's a lot of other people who had a lot of reason. Oh, one other reason that I've heard that I found really compelling for it to not be Putin is that it happened right in the middle of the BRICS summit, which was a huge international summit. And Putin's not going to want it to. Why would he do this assassination right in the middle of this thing where he wants to have Russia have a really good positive public image in front of potential allies like the Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians and the Saudi Arabians? That I think that's those bunches of evidence really add up to me that Putin isn't my prime suspect, but I do have some other suspects.
Yeah, I know. To be honest with you, that's my guess. I think Putin, maybe people in the defense ministry said, I really want to just get rid of this guy. We can take care of it. And Putin's like, you know what? The less I know, the better. I do. It could be. And they had the most reason to want to kill him, right? In my opinion, Putin had a lot of good reasons to want to just get rid of him too, right? He embarrassed the Russian government. He embarrassed him. He led an honest to God rebellion against the, not effective one, but like a legitimate rebellion against the Russian government right in the middle of the existential crisis with the conflict with Ukraine. That's my guess. I think Putin killed him. In terms of like, to bring it kind of back to Joe Gallo, my guess is the commission said, we got to get rid of this guy. He's making us all look bad. He's not following any of the rules. Tried to kidnap one of our bosses, kind of making us all look like fools. Hired some people and got rid of them.
I think that it really could be like that lower tier thing that you were talking about in Russian society, where it keeps the top guy, the czar, or in this case, Putin, kind of insulated. And it could have really have been inside of the government fighting, where either the defense minister or some top general like Surovikin, or even people inside of the Air Force. Could you imagine how mad they would be in any nation's military if some outside force killed a bunch of their people and then they're still just walking around? They're going to find some way to get rid of that guy and make him pay.
Especially a guy that's not even really, he wasn't even really a soldier. He was, right? But he just kind of, it's not like he grew up in the military or came from his family came from like a military background or anything like that. It was basically an outsider. Came in and started talking all this crap about about the army and the ministry and how they were running the war effort. And then he tried to lead a rebellion against the government itself. But according to him, he was actually a rebellion against the war ministry and the military. Of course, none of them are happy about him.
Now, wrapping this up, we talked a lot about this offline. I think we both came to it from a different perspective. These two characters, Joe and Prigozhin, are fighting against the system. I think we both liked the idea of people who are disruptors, that people who broke up the system. What did you think about that whole idea of these people who tried to disrupt the system? Because I think that you were attracted to that.
Yeah, which is funny because I'm more of a, kind of lay my cards on the table. I'm more of kind of like a traditionalist, paleocon type, like right winger, and you're more of like a libertarian. And you seem to be a little bit more critical of these type of guys that are like system disruptors, whereas I am like, I'm not gonna lie, like there's a lot of parts of Prigozhin I'm like, you know what, I kind of get where this guy's coming from. Like, I understand it. And even Joe Gallo, I'm like, yeah, I hate Joe Profaci too. I would have been there with him. Like, let's do something about this. Which is, I find that kind of interesting. But I've always kind of been somewhat sympathetic to these like system disruptors, like just people that are just willing to call out glaring BS when they see it. Sometimes it's not the most effective way of going about it, but in my personal life, I'm very much like that. It actually kind of drives me nuts when I see people that are just able to like just go along with things and not call it out. I'm not saying online or anything like that, actually in person, be like, this is stupid. Look, why are we doing it like this? I've always been very sympathetic to those types of people. And during the course of this podcast, like I understand where Prigozhin's coming from. Like, where's the ammunition? I understand where Joe Gallo's coming from. Like, where's the money? Like, you're stealing money from us and we're taking all the risk. I'm the one out here every day. I could get killed or get caught with a crime and end up doing, 20 years in prison or 15 years in prison, which he ended up doing. Not 20 years, but did a significant amount of time in prison. And we're getting very little rewards for it. So
for me, I always see it that people like that, they're hammers and every single problem is a nail. And they don't see that there's other ways that you can handle situations without just constantly bashing and bashing and bashing. And I think that, these are extremes, obviously. Like, you're not going to go into your job and take out your boss because you disagree with the way he's running the show. And I've certainly worked at jobs where I disagree with what the boss says. But I think that in the end, you can, I clearly, with both of our situations, and neither of us are in high stakes positions, where of any sort that killing a boss or, in some way revolting would ever even be on the table. But you could see you can go into work and you can call your boss a jerk and gather everybody else up to bitch and moan about him or her and make a big thing like that. Or you can try to do your job the best way that you know how, deal with the limitations of that, and try to fix things, knowing that maybe you will rise through the ranks. Like I think with Joe Gallo, he could have become a capo if he had done a little bit of go along to get along.
Well, in Joe Gallo's defense, I guess maybe he said that's what we were doing, right? And we're still getting ripped off, and it didn't seem like there was any light at the end of the tunnel. With Prigozhin, it's, we've been fighting this war, we've won battles, and then you guys turn around and start saying like there's no ammunition, there's no food, right? And then I started hearing about, we're going to get merged into the regular Russian military. Like, where does that leave me? And like, I get it from his perspective in terms of like, like more normal experiences. You mentioned like bosses and stuff like that. There's people that will just, nod their heads and just agree with everything that's said. But there's always the person's like says like, no, this is, BS. Like this isn't going to work. I mean, is that the most effective way of going about wanting to get your change? But I mean, I respect it when somebody calls it out as opposed to just kind of going along with it because, I don't know, the boss says so.
But I don't think that exactly exists in a dichotomy of either you're a yes man or you're going and telling your boss. There's so many swear words I'd like to use for this, but basically going in and telling your boss off. There's something in between that. You're not either just a yes man or you're the person who goes into and lays into your boss and screams and has fights about it. You can, in anything, you can work to try and change something of the system to make yourself better, your own situation better, and to make the whole organization better. I think with Joe, maybe he didn't see a light at the tunnel, but I think that for both Joe and Prigozhin, they're being led by a lot of vanity, a lot of greed, and just huge egos that they knew that I know how to fix it. Joe Profaci is just going to keep making things worse. And if I get in charge here, I'm going to fix it.
Short-sightedness, I think, is the word for it, right? Especially in Joe Gallo's case, I believe it was short-sighted. Like, what was really the end goal? Total, like, did you think you were just going to kidnap Joe Profaci and kill him, and then you were just going to be the boss, and that would be the end of it? And Prigozhin's, from Prigozhin's perspective, is I'd like to really know what he thought the end goal was. Did he think he was just going to march in and Putin's going to be like, you know what, Prigozhin, me and you have been friends for a while. You used to serve me food at your restaurant. You're going to run the war now. Like, I don't, you know what I mean?
I'm going to sack this career politician, Shoigu, and sack the leading generals and get rid of all of them. And Prigozhin, you can run the whole shebang because you marched on Moscow, with your own personal army. Like, are you out of your flippin' mind?
Yeah, I don't know. I like that idea of Putin being just saying to himself, it's like, well, he served me a nice steak that one time. So,
yeah,
I'm gonna lead him into basically the modern equivalent of, like, I don't know, World War, the Boer War or the Crimea War, I guess would be a really good, is actually a better comparison. Like a modern version of the Crimea War. We're just going to let you run the conflict. It's just, I don't know what he was thinking. In some ways I like him, and just as kind of his attitude and, some of the things that he said, but I don't know. He wasn't really thinking very clearly. Obviously he's dead now. Right. So
yeah, I think with both of them, like, they just went. And I agree with you. There's a lot that's admirable about fighting the system. Like, going in and telling the boss off, like, this is how it should really be done here. And it's all wrong. And it's this, but you're not just alienating the boss when you're doing that. You're alienating a lot of other people. Yeah, there might be people who agree with you and they'll even come and back you up. But there's other people who have different ideas, and the system might be working for them. I think that that's a thing that a lot of people ignore in situations like that, is you think that the system is completely screwed up, but other people can legitimately think that everything's humming along really fine. And you're both not necessarily wrong, or you're both not necessarily 100% right either.
And also, I think sometimes people get caught up in what the system is doing wrong to them, that they sometimes they don't realize all the good that the system is doing for them. You know, like even your job, they'll use, like, this is for the most part kind of like the dichotomy that we're using, but daily, it's usually someone's job, right? People tend to focus on what the job's not doing for them, or the things that they hate about the job, as opposed to realizing some of the things that they do like about the job. Like, are you comfortable at the job? Did they let you get away with certain things as you've been there for, so long? And, do you enjoy the people that you work with? Because, I've worked at some jobs where I didn't really like anybody that I worked with, like, at all. And it was, and maybe the job was easier, but I don't know. I was miserable at a lot of these jobs because I just didn't like anybody that I worked with. Are they willing to work with you with some things, but not willing to work with you on other things? I find, like, just people tend to focus on, especially like when it comes to bureaucracy or systems that are in place, they tend to focus on the things that aren't working for them, and then they lose perspective of the things that are working for them.
Yeah, and bureaucracies and systems are really, really, really hard to change. And just going in like a bull and thrashing around is probably the thing that's least likely to change a bureaucracy or a system of any size.
Well, like, I mean, if you look at Joe Gallo, being within the Five Family system, the Commission, and the Colombo family, he was given access to different avenues of criminality that he just wouldn't have had access to if he was by himself right from the get-go. And if you look at Prigozhin, I mean, buddy, you went from, like, you're running like a restaurant to major catering for the Russian military to, you're one of the top soldiers in the biggest conflict of the modern world. And, it only takes like 10 months and a couple of things to go bad, where you go, you know what, actually this whole thing is messed up. Like, I'm going to overthrow the government. It's like, did not forget, like, there was the whole system in place that put you in the position that you're in right now, right? Which, you started off as like a 2-bit criminal and living in the Soviet Union, spending time in a prison, in a penal colony. Obviously the system worked for you.
Well, I think let's leave this really crazy series on Joe Gallo with this really crazy wrap-up episode. Let's just leave it at that for today. If people enjoy this kind of episode, just definitely reach out to us at crime@a2zhistorypage.com. You can find us on Twitter or X or Facebook, Instagram, kind of. Definitely check us out on YouTube. We put out YouTube shorts, and we'll probably start putting out some exclusive YouTube content as well. Search for A2Z History Page on YouTube. Links to all of this will be in the show notes. The best thing you can do, though, is, as we always say, if you like what you're hearing, tell a friend of yours so that your friends can become friends of ours.